You're nothing but dead weight, even with that child inside you." Marissa's voice sliced through the ballroom like a blade. Grace froze as red wine splashed across her simple dress, dripping down her swollen belly. Gasps filled the glittering hall, followed by cruel laughter. Chandeliers sparkled above, but the only light she felt was the burning of humiliation on her skin. At Marissa's side stood Martin, her husband. To the world, Martin was the charming businessman, the perfect gentleman. To Grace, he was the man who had once sworn to love her, now standing silent while another woman mocked her. And Marissa, Martin's so-called family friend, was no stranger to Grace. She was polished, ruthless, the woman who had always lingered too close, who now stood boldly at his side, her sequined gown shimmering like victory. But tonight, Martin didn't shield his wife. He didn't even look ashamed. Instead, Martin smirked, straightened his cufflinks, and let the moment drag. "Maybe she should have stayed home," he said coldly. The crowd erupted. Some shook their heads, others whispered, but many laughed. Neighbors, colleagues, strangers, people Grace had once smiled at now turned her pain into their entertainment. Marissa clung tighter to Martin's arm, lips curling in satisfaction. "Some people don't belong in places like this," she said, sharp enough for everyone to hear. "And she's proof." Grace's heart thundered, her cheeks burned, her body trembled, her fingers pressed against her belly, as if shielding her unborn child from the cruelty in the room. Tears threatened, but she would not give them the pleasure. Am I truly this worthless? Just a shadow at his side? She lifted her chin. She looked past the pity, past the laughter, past the cruel smirks. In that moment, she buried her shame and replaced it with something far more dangerous. They thought she was powerless. They thought she was just a poor, pregnant wife. What Martin and Marissa, and everyone in that room, didn't know was that Grace carried more than the child inside her. She carried an empire, and when her silence ended, their world would shatter. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To the outside world, Martin was the definition of a perfect husband. He had charm that could melt a room, a smile that seemed carved for magazine covers, and the polished confidence of a man who always won. At company dinners, he held Grace's hand beneath the table, kissed her cheek for all to see, and raised a toast declaring her his rock. Grace would sit quietly beside him, her soft smile steady, her heart secretly hoping that maybe, just maybe, this was real, that the man who praised her in public might love her again in private. But once the champagne glasses were empty and the guests had gone home, Martin's hand would slip from hers. His eyes would harden, his voice turn flat, and silence would stretch between them like a wall. At family gatherings, he was even more convincing. He told his sisters that Grace was the reason he could face each day with courage. He hugged her before everyone, bragging that she was his greatest blessing. Relatives clapped, cousins sighed, and older women whispered, "If only our men loved us the way Martin loves Grace." Grace would sit through it all, nodding politely, hiding the ache in her chest, because when the relatives went home and the lights dimmed, there were no hugs, no soft words, no warmth. There was only distance. At home, his kisses had long turned perfunctory, his smiles rehearsed, his touch absent. Grace lived beside him like a shadow, wondering if she had done something wrong, if her worth had been drained away with each passing day. And yet she endured, because she was carrying life inside her. Because she wanted her child to grow with both parents no matter how cold the nights became. And then there was Marissa. She was introduced to Grace as an old family friend. A woman with sharp eyes, painted lips, and a laugh that always seemed a little too loud, a little too familiar. She visited often, at dinners, at corporate parties, at family functions, always at Martin's side, always lingering too long in conversation. At first, Grace thought she was imagining it. She told herself she was being paranoid, that her own insecurities were making shadows where there were none. But then she noticed the small things. The way Marissa's hand brushed Martin's sleeve during conversation. The way Martin's smile lingered on her longer than necessary. The whispers between them. The glances they thought no one saw. Grace saw. A wife always sees. One evening, at a company gala, Marissa leaned in just a little too close while Martin told a joke. Her manicured fingers tapped against his chest as she laughed. Grace was seated only a few chairs away. She gripped her water glass so tightly she thought it might shatter. Martin didn't notice. Or worse, he did, and he didn't care. Maybe I'm invisible. Maybe I've been invisible all along. Grace forced a smile for the guests who occasionally turned toward her, nodding politely as though she were part of the conversation. But deep inside, her heart twisted. She thought of her unborn child, the tiny life she carried so carefully. She thought of what kind of world this child would enter, a world where its father paraded with another woman, and its mother was treated like furniture. But Grace didn't speak. She never did. That was Martin's greatest weapon. Silence. Not shouting, not violence, not scandal. Just silence so heavy it buried her voice before she could find it. And yet beneath that silence something stirred, because Grace wasn't as powerless as she seemed. She carried more than her child. She carried secrets of her own, investments her husband didn't know about, connections he overlooked, assets hidden so carefully they seemed invisible, just like she was. But Grace had learned something Martin never did. Silence could be strength. And one day, when the time was right, her silence would roar louder than all of Martin's laughter. For now, though, she endured. She endured the hand-holding charades at dinners. She endured the whispers of relatives who envied her perfect life. She endured Marissa's smirks and Martin's cold glances. She endured, because storms always begin as whispers. And Grace was the storm. Grace could feel the change long before anyone else dared to notice. Martin no longer bothered with the little performances at home. The occasional kiss on the cheek, the rehearsed smile, the polite questions about her day. They vanished one by one, like leaves stripped from a dying tree. Now, when he walked through the door, he went straight to his study. His phone pressed tightly against his ear, his voice low but animated. He rarely spoke to her anymore, except to comment on dinner or to remind her of another event they needed to attend together. And when Grace asked, "Who was that on the phone?" he would smile thinly and say, "Work." But Grace wasn't a fool. She heard the laughter that followed his conversations, the soft murmurs that didn't sound like business at all. And sometimes, when she passed by the study late at night, she caught her own name followed by silence. The kind of silence that meant she was the subject, not the audience. Marissa was everywhere now. If Martin was going to a board meeting, Marissa was conveniently consulting. If Martin had a late-night dinner with clients, Marissa was somehow there too. And at every party, every gathering, she clung to him with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. At first, Marissa had been careful. Sly glances, whispered jokes, subtle touches. But now she didn't bother to hide it. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, touched his shoulder too freely, stood too close at photographs. And Martin? He didn't stop her. He encouraged her. One evening, Grace arrived at a dinner earlier than expected. She walked into the restaurant to see Martin seated at the bar, Marissa's hand resting on his thigh. Their heads bent close together, whispering, smiling. For a moment, Grace stood frozen at the doorway. She thought of turning back, of pretending she hadn't seen, but her feet carried her forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The sound made them both look up. Martin's face didn't even flicker with guilt. Instead, he smiled coolly, slid Marissa's hand from his leg and said, "Grace, you're early." Marissa simply smirked, lifting her wine glass in a mocking toast. Grace forced a smile, forced herself to sit at the table, forced her hands not to tremble as the waiter poured her water. Do they think I don't see? Do they think I'm blind? Dinner was agony. Every word between Martin and Marissa carried a double edge. Every glance exchanged across the table cut deeper than the last. Grace stayed quiet, nodding when necessary, swallowing her pride along with each bite of food. That night, back at home, Martin didn't speak a word. He took off his suit, loosened his tie, and slipped into bed without even looking at her. Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her hand resting over her belly. What kind of father will you have, my child? What kind of world am I bringing you into? The shame was unbearable. To outsiders, she was the luckiest woman alive. To herself, she was invisible, unwanted, discarded. And yet, in the silence, Grace remembered something Martin had forgotten. She had always been underestimated. Even as a child, she had learned to keep her head down, to let people think she was quiet, simple, harmless. No one ever asked what she was building, what she was planning. No one ever knew about the accounts she had opened years ago, or the investments her late father had left in her name. Martin thought he was the provider. He thought he was the center of their world. But what he never knew, what she had never told him, was that the ground he stood on was hers. Grace closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "They will know. One day, they will all know." But for now, she endured. She endured Marissa's smug smiles, Martin's indifference, the whispers of relatives who still believed her life was perfect. She endured the loneliness, the humiliation, the ache of loving a man who paraded another woman before her. Because endurance was power, and storms always begin in silence. The ballroom shimmered like a jewel box, chandeliers spilling golden light over polished marble floors. Waiters glided between tables with silver trays, the air thick with laughter, perfume, and the clink of fine crystal. It was the kind of evening Martin thrived in, a stage built for men like him. Martin stood at the center of it all, his broad shoulders straight in a perfectly tailored suit, his arm draped around Grace's as though she were the crown jewel on display. His smile dazzled, his laugh rang out, his charm made every head turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, lifting his champagne glass high, "tonight we celebrate not only partnerships, but loyalty, love, and the future that lies ahead." The crowd erupted into applause. Someone shouted, "Here, here!" Others clinked glasses, smiling warmly at the handsome man who seemed to have everything: success, wealth, a glowing wife by his side. Grace forced a smile, the corners of her lips trembling as though they too were tired of pretending. She held her belly protectively with one hand, her child shifting within as though sensing the tension in the air. If only they knew. If only they saw what I saw when the lights went down. The applause faded and Martin basked in the moment, bowing slightly as though it were a standing ovation. And then, from the far side of the room, she appeared. Marissa. Her sequined silver gown caught the light like shards of glass, each step deliberate, predatory. The crowd parted subtly as she moved, heads turning, whispers following. Her painted lips curled into a smile that wasn't kind. It was claiming. And when she reached Martin, she didn't hesitate. She slipped her hand onto his free arm, pressing herself close with the ease of someone who believed she belonged there. "Oh, Martin," she purred, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Always the perfect host." The crowd chuckled, indulgent. "Such a close family friend," one man whispered. "How lucky Grace is." Lucky. Grace's heart tightened. She stood frozen, her grip on her dress so tight the fabric nearly tore. Martin looked down at Marissa, his eyes warm in a way Grace hadn't seen directed at her in years. He didn't remove her hand. He didn't step back. He let her cling to him as though it were natural. Grace's breath hitched. Then it happened. A waiter passed by with a tray of red wine. Marissa's hand shot out. Perhaps it was intentional, perhaps not, but the glass tipped. The crimson liquid spilled in a sharp stream, splattering across Grace's chest and stomach. Gasps erupted like thunder. Someone cried out, "Oh no!" The hush that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Grace. The wine dripped down her belly, pooling at the hem of her dress. For a moment she couldn't move. The humiliation froze her in place, her body trembling with the heat of shame. Marissa let out a soft, mocking laugh that carried across the silence. "Oh dear," she said sweetly, her tone laced with venom. "Clumsy as ever. Some people just don't belong in places like this." The crowd shifted uneasily. A few chuckled, others shook their heads. Whispers rippled through the hall. Grace lifted her eyes, searching desperately for Martin. But Martin didn't reach for her. He didn't hand her a napkin, didn't shield her from the stares. Instead, he smirked, the corners of his mouth curving with cruel amusement. "Maybe she should have stayed home," he said. Laughter exploded. Guests exchanged knowing glances. Women raised their brows. Men chuckled into their drinks. The room, once filled with admiration, now pulsed with ridicule. Grace's heart hammered in her chest. Her cheeks burned hotter than the wine dripping down her body. She pressed one trembling hand against her belly, as if to shield her unborn child from the cruelty that surrounded her. "Don't cry. Don't let them see. Don't give them what they want." Marissa leaned closer to Martin, her voice like poison sugar. "She looks so lost. Imagine being married to that." The laughter cut sharper this time. Grace's knees wobbled, her breath shallow. Every glance in the room felt like a dagger. Neighbors she had greeted kindly, colleagues she had welcomed into her home, strangers who now looked at her as if she were pitiful, laughable, disposable. The humiliation was suffocating. For a moment, she thought she might collapse right there on the ballroom floor. And then, something shifted. Grace lifted her chin. Her eyes, glassy with unshed tears, scanned the crowd. She met their stares one by one, the mocking, the pitying, the indifferent. And with every pair of eyes she met, her shame sank deeper inside, replaced with something colder, sharper, stronger. They thought she was powerless. They thought she was just a poor, pregnant wife with nowhere to go. But Grace knew something no one else in that room knew. Not Martin, not Marissa, not the smug guests reveling in her humiliation. She carried more than the child in her womb. She carried an empire. And though she walked out of that ballroom slowly, her head held high despite the stain on her dress, she carried with her a promise. A storm had been born. And when it broke, every single person in that room would remember the night they laughed at Grace. The night air was sharp when Grace stepped out of the ballroom. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, guests lingered at the marble steps pretending not to stare. Her dress clung to her body, the wine stain dark against the red fabric, her swollen belly framed for the world to see. But Grace didn't pause. She didn't explain. She didn't plead. She walked straight through the murmuring crowd, her chin high, her hand steady over her belly. Each step echoed like defiance on the marble floor. Behind her, laughter trickled from the ballroom, muffled but still cruel. By the time she reached the car, the tears she had fought back all night threatened to fall. She slid into the back seat, the driver glancing at her through the mirror with quiet concern. "Home," she whispered. The city lights blurred past as she pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Her hand rested over her stomach, feeling the faintest movement of the child within. The humiliation replayed in her mind on a loop. Marissa's smirk, Martin's smirk, the crowd's laughter, the wine running down her dress like blood. Her throat tightened. For a moment she thought she might break, collapse into sobs. But she didn't. She couldn't. Because somewhere in the silence beneath the pain, something stronger stirred. At home, the mansion loomed large and cold. She walked through the double doors, the polished floors gleaming beneath the chandeliers. But it felt empty. It always had. Grace went straight to the sitting room, lowered herself into the armchair, and closed her eyes. The silence wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. For years, that silence had been her prison. the space where Martin's indifference lived, where her voice died before it reached his ears. But tonight, the silence felt different. Tonight, it was alive. Her gaze fell on the drawer beneath the bookshelf. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled it open. Inside were the files no one ever asked about. Not Martin, not even her closest friends. Thick folders filled with papers, bank statements, property deeds, investment reports. Grace pulled one out, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened it to reveal numbers that would make most men's heads spin. Her late father had taught her to invest quietly, to never place all her trust in another's hands, not even a husband's. Before she married Martin, she had properties in her name, accounts tucked away, stocks that grew like roots underground. And when Martin spent lavishly, chasing his image of success, she built more. She invested. She multiplied. Martin believed he was the provider. Martin believed everything they had was because of him. But Martin never knew the truth. The empire was hers. Grace traced the lines of the documents, the rising numbers, the expanding list of assets. She thought of the way Marissa had smirked, of the way Martin had humiliated her in front of the world. They think I am nothing. They think I am weak. But they stand on ground that belongs to me. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not of joy, but of resolve. She closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer. The storm inside her was no longer a whisper. It was growing, taking shape, demanding to be heard. Later that night, Martin came home. The sound of his car in the driveway, his shoes on the polished floor, the jingle of his cufflinks being tossed onto the counter. All of it was routine. He walked into the sitting room, saw her there, still in the stained dress, and smirked. "You should have cleaned up before coming home," he said, pouring himself a drink. "People were watching. You embarrassed me tonight." Grace didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. He sipped his whiskey, his tone casual. "Marissa says you looked pathetic. She might be right. Maybe next time, stay home." The storm inside her surged, but she remained silent. Silence had always been Martin's weapon. Tonight, it was hers, because Grace knew something he didn't. His downfall had already begun. That night in bed, Martin slept easily, his breathing deep and steady, his back turned to her. Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling, one hand over her belly, the other curled into the sheets. She whispered softly to the child within her. "They don't know who your mother is. They don't know what I've built for you. But they will. One day soon, they will." The storm rumbled in her chest. It was no longer silence. It was a promise. The morning after the gala, the newspapers told only half the story. Martin Hale hosts lavish corporate gala. One headline read. Another praised his commitment to future partnerships. Photos of Martin shaking hands, laughing with executives, smiling for cameras filled the pages. But tucked in the margins of those glossy spreads was a single photo, a blurred shot of Grace, her dress stained, her face turned away, Marissa smirking in the background. The caption read, "A small mishap," but the night ended on a high note. Grace traced her finger over the image, her lips tightening. A mishap? No, it had been humiliation carefully staged, and yet the world had minimized it, excused it, ignored it, just as they always ignored her. She folded the paper neatly, set it aside, and dialed a number she hadn't used in months. The voice on the other end was warm, professional. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale. It's been a while." "Too long," Grace replied evenly. "We need to meet. Today." The office smelled faintly of leather and ink, its walls lined with polished shelves. Her attorney, Mr. Carter, leaned forward across the desk, his eyes curious. "Is there a problem?" Grace placed the folder of documents before him. Deeds, accounts, investments. She watched his brows rise as he scanned through them. "I had no idea," he murmured. "This is considerable." Because no one was supposed to know, Grace said quietly. Not even Martin, especially not Martin. Mr. Carter nodded slowly. And now you want to protect it, Grace cut in. Every asset, every account, lock it down. I want Martin to have no access, no knowledge. I want him to believe I am still powerless until I decide otherwise. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. Mr. Carter studied her a moment, then smiled faintly. You've been underestimated, Mrs. Hale. Perhaps for the last time. Grace exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. For the first time in months, she felt the storm inside her take shape. No longer just anger, but strategy. Meanwhile, Martin was celebrating. At his office downtown, he leaned back in his chair, Marissa perched on the edge of his desk, her legs crossed elegantly. You were brilliant last night, she said, running a finger along his tie. The way you brushed her off, people saw. They know she doesn't matter anymore. Martin smirked, sipping his scotch. Grace is convenient. She plays the part. But she's never been enough. Marissa's laugh was low, satisfied. She looked pathetic. Everyone pitied her. Martin shrugged. Pity isn't dangerous. She'll stay quiet. She always does. But he was wrong. At home, Grace walked through the halls of the mansion, her heels clicking softly against the marble. She passed portraits of Martin's family, reminders of his legacy. But tonight, she stopped before the empty wall she had left bare, the one space in the house untouched by him. This is where our story begins, she whispered to herself. She thought of her child, the small heartbeat she carried, the life that would inherit not humiliation, but power. She thought of Martin, smug and oblivious, believing himself untouchable. And she thought of Marissa, foolish enough to think she had already won. Grace's hand pressed against her belly, steady and protective. They think I am nothing, but I am everything. In the weeks that followed, Grace's moves were quiet, invisible. She met with accountants, she transferred assets, she restructured holdings. Every step was deliberate, cautious, hidden from Martin's gaze. And still, at dinners and events, she played her part. She smiled beside him, nodded politely when he spoke, endured Marissa's smirks and whispers. The world still saw a perfect marriage, but beneath the surface the ground was shifting. One night, Martin returned home late. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed, his cologne sharp. Grace sat in the living room, her dress simple, her posture composed. "You're awake?" he said, surprised. She looked at him calmly. "I couldn't sleep." He poured himself a drink, his tone careless. "Don't wait up for me next time. You look tired. It's not a good look for you." Her lips tightened, but instead of responding, she stood, smoothing her dress. "Good night, Martin." And for the first time when she walked past him, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel weak. She felt powerful, because she knew what he didn't. His empire was crumbling. Marissa, meanwhile, grew bolder. She appeared at Martin's office daily, accompanied him to functions, and began whispering openly about their future together. At one gala, Grace heard Marissa's laugh from across the room. "She's nothing more than a shadow," she said, not caring who listened. "Martin will divorce her soon enough, and when he does, she'll have nothing." Grace turned, her eyes locking on Marissa's across the room. She didn't speak, she didn't move, but her silence was louder than any retort. Because Grace knew the truth, and when the time came, Marissa would choke on those words. That night, as she lay awake once more, Grace whispered into the silence. "They've mistaken my quiet for weakness, but soon they will see." Her eyes closed, and for the first time in months, she dreamed not of humiliation, but of victory. The storm was no longer just gathering, it was ready to break. The first crack in Martin's empire appeared on a Tuesday morning. He was in his office downtown, his feet propped on the mahogany desk, when his assistant rushed in with a pale face. "Sir, the Anders contract. It's been pulled." Martin frowned, lowering his phone. "Pulled? Why?" The assistant shifted uncomfortably. "They said funding dried up. Their board voted to walk away." Martin leaned back, his smirk unfazed. "Anders is spineless. He'll come crawling back." But Anders didn't. By Friday, 2 more contracts had fallen through. Clients who once begged for Martin's attention suddenly became unavailable, their polite excuses carrying an edge of finality. Meetings were canceled, calls unanswered. The air around Martin's name, once gilded, began to sour. He told himself it was bad luck, a temporary downturn. But whispers spread, whispers he couldn't control. And Grace knew. At home, she read the emails before Martin ever saw them. The accountants reported losses. Assets shifted away from his reach, accounts under review. What Martin didn't know was that Grace had already placed walls around everything she owned. The ground he stood on was hers, and now it was slipping. Grace said nothing. She still played her part, the quiet wife at his side, her hands folded, her eyes downcast. But inside, she burned with a quiet satisfaction. This is only the beginning. Marissa noticed the shift too. One evening, as she lounged in Martin's office chair with a glass of wine, she asked, "What's happening? Why are people pulling away?" Martin scowled. "Business is business. They'll come back." Marissa tilted her head, her sequined dress catching the light. "Maybe, or maybe they've lost faith in you. You don't look like a man in control anymore." His jaw tightened. "Don't question me." She sipped her wine, her smirk faint. "I'm not questioning, I'm observing." The second crack came at a gala the following week. Martin strode into the room with Marissa at his side, her hand looped tightly through his arm. The crowd that once swarmed him parted politely, offering smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Conversations hushed as he passed, then resumed with quiet laughter behind his back. Grace arrived later, moving with her usual quiet dignity. Though still dressed simply, her posture carried a calm that radiated strength. People looked at her differently now, some with pity, but some with curiosity, as though they sensed something had shifted. Martin watched as a senior investor crossed the room to greet Grace, ignoring him entirely. The man bowed slightly, murmured something that made Grace smile, then walked away with respect in his eyes. Martin's chest burned. For the first time in years, he wasn't the center of the room. Marissa noticed too. She leaned into him and whispered, "They're slipping away from you." He shrugged, but his hand tightened on his glass until the stem threatened to snap. At home, the tension grew. Martin snapped more easily. His words, once dismissive, turned sharp. Grace bore it all with the same silence she always had, her calmness only fueling his rage. "You don't even fight back," he snarled one night. "Pathetic." Grace met his eyes, her expression steady. Not everything needs to be said. The storm in her silence unsettled him, though he would never admit it. Meanwhile, Marissa's mask began to crack. When Martin's accounts froze unexpectedly, she questioned him outright. "What's going on, Martin? Why can't we use the money from Geneva?" "It's tied up temporarily," he lied, waving a dismissive hand. Marissa's eyes narrowed. "Temporarily or permanently?" "Don't start," Martin warned. But Marissa did start. She began asking more questions, showing less patience. The glamorous confidence she once carried faltered when the credit cards declined, when the gifts stopped arriving, when the whispers about Martin's failures reached her ears. "You promised me a future," she snapped one night. "But what future? I'm not going down with you." Martin's face darkened. "You ungrateful." But Marissa had already turned away. And through it all, Grace watched. She watched Martin unravel piece by piece. She watched Marissa's loyalty dissolve like sugar in water. She watched the empire he believed was untouchable crumble at his feet. And she said nothing, because her silence was no longer weakness. It was power. The final crack came when Martin tried to access one of their shared accounts. The screen blinked red. Access denied. He tried again. Same message. Confused, he called the bank. The polite voice on the line explained, "Mr. Hale, your access has been revoked. All inquiries must go through Mrs. Grace Hale." His blood ran cold. "Mrs. Hale?" he repeated, his voice sharp. "Yes, sir," the banker replied. "She is the sole controlling party on this account. Would you like me to connect you with her representative?" Martin slammed the phone down, his hands trembling. For the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't in control. That night, he stormed into the house, his tie askew, his face pale with fury. Grace sat calmly in the living room, a book open on her lap. "What have you done?" he demanded. She looked up, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "Protected what was always mine." Martin's mouth opened, then closed. No words came, because deep down, he knew the truth. The empire had never been his. It had always been hers. The grand hall was alive with chatter, glasses clinking under golden chandeliers. It was another high-profile evening, filled with executives, politicians, and journalists, the kind of event Martin once dominated. He strode in wearing his best suit, but the whispers followed him like shadows. Contracts lost, accounts frozen, deals dissolved. His name no longer carried weight. His smile faltered each time someone turned away. Marissa clung to his arm, her sequined gown dazzling under the lights. But her eyes darted nervously across the room. She felt the shift too. The way people glanced at her with thinly veiled disdain. The way conversations quieted when she approached. Then the room hushed. Grace had arrived. She entered in a gown of deep emerald satin. Her hair swept elegantly, her posture regal. One hand rested gently over her belly, the other holding a simple clutch. She did not rush. She did not bow her head. She walked as though the marble floor itself belonged to her. For the first time in months, people didn't whisper about her humiliation. They whispered about her power. "That's Mrs. Hale," someone murmured. "She looks incredible. I heard she controls the Hale accounts now." Martin's chest tightened. His jaw clenched as he watched eyes turn from him to her, admiration replacing pity. Grace reached the center of the hall. The host of the evening, a senior investor, approached her with a warm smile. "Mrs. Hale," he said respectfully, "may we have a few words from you?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. It had always been Martin who commanded the stage. Tonight they asked for Grace. She inclined her head gracefully and stepped up to the podium. The microphone gleamed under the light as silence fell over the room. Her voice was calm, steady, but carried like thunder. "For years, I stood beside a man who told the world he was the foundation of our family, our business, our future. And for years I allowed myself to be silent, even as I was dismissed, mocked, humiliated." The crowd shifted uneasily. Eyes flicked to Martin, whose face burned red. "But silence," Grace continued, her gaze sweeping across the hall, "is not weakness. It is strength. Strength to endure, strength to build, strength to rise." She paused, letting the words settle. Her hand pressed lightly over her belly. "What many of you don't know is that the foundation Martin Hale claimed as his own was never his. The accounts, the properties, the investments, they were mine. They have always been mine." Gasps erupted. Murmurs filled the hall. Martin's eyes widened, his chest heaving as though the air had been sucked from his lungs. Grace's voice sharpened. "While he mocked me, while he paraded his mistress, while he treated me as though I were nothing, I was building everything. And tonight I am done being silent." The room roared with whispers and gasps. Some clapped softly, others stared in shock, but every eye was on Grace. Marissa's grip on Martin's arm slipped, her face drained of color. She hissed under her breath. "You didn't tell me." "Shut up," Martin snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. Grace turned her gaze on them both, her eyes like steel. "Martin believed he could humiliate me in public. He believed he could replace me with a woman who mocks what she doesn't understand. But power does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who endures, who builds, who chooses when to strike." Marissa's lips parted, but no words came. Martin stared at Grace, his pride crumbling in real time. The hall erupted in applause. Not polite applause, thunderous, standing applause. Executives, investors, strangers, they rose to their feet, clapping, some even cheering. Grace stood tall, her chin high, her eyes unwavering. For the first time, she wasn't Martin's shadow. She wasn't his rock. She wasn't his shame. She was the empire. And Martin was nothing. The aftermath was swift. Reporters swarmed Grace as she left the stage, their cameras flashing, their questions spilling over each other. She answered calmly with dignity, her voice steady. Martin tried to follow, to pull her arm, but the crowd blocked him. No one looked at him anymore. His name, his power, his respect, gone. Marissa slipped away quietly, her sequined dress vanishing into the night. She didn't look back. Grace walked out of the hall with her head high, the applause still echoing behind her. Her child shifted within her, as though responding to the rhythm of triumph. They thought I was powerless, she thought, but I was everything they could never be. The applause from the gala still rang in Martin's ears long after the hall had emptied. But it wasn't applause for him. For the first time in his life, the room hadn't belonged to him. It belonged to Grace. The papers were merciless the next morning. Grace Hale, the woman behind the empire. Martin Hale exposed, living off his wife's fortune. The mistress disappears as the billionaire wife speaks out. Martin's face was splashed across the covers, but no longer as a man of success. He was a footnote, a cautionary tale, a husband who mocked the very woman who held his world together. Grace's face, radiant and calm, was everywhere. Martin's fall was quick and merciless. Contracts dried up overnight. Investors refused his calls. Partners who once praised him now treated him like a ghost. His office emptied one by one as employees left, unwilling to tie their names to a sinking ship. By the end of the week, Martin's accounts were frozen, his credit lines severed. He stormed into banks demanding answers, only to be met with polite but firm replies. All inquiries must go through Mrs. Grace Hale. The name cut him each time. He returned home late one evening, his tie askew, his pride in tatters. The mansion that had once felt like his throne now seemed colder, heavier. Grace sat in the living room, her gown replaced with a simple robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up from her book as he entered, her gaze calm, steady. "You've ruined me," Martin spat, his voice hoarse. Grace closed the book gently, her hand resting on her belly. "No, Martin. You ruined yourself. I only stopped protecting you from the consequences." His mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, he was speechless. Marissa didn't stay. When the gifts stopped coming, when the restaurants grew fewer, when the whispers turned cruel, she slipped out of Martin's life like smoke. Grace saw her once more, weeks later, at a cafe downtown. Marissa sat with another man, laughing that same sharp laugh, her hand on his arm. She didn't look at Grace, didn't acknowledge her. She had moved on to her next opportunity. Grace felt no anger, no jealousy, only pity. As Martin's world shrank, Grace's expanded. Reporters sought her out for interviews. Investors approached her directly. Friends and strangers alike wrote letters of admiration. She was no longer seen as the humiliated wife, but as a woman of power, resilience, dignity. At charity galas, she spoke of strength. At business meetings, she spoke of vision. And always, she spoke of her child. the future she carried within her, the life she was building for both of them. The same society that once laughed at her now applauded her. But Grace didn't rise for their approval. She rose for herself. Martin, meanwhile, dwindled. The mansion was no longer his. He moved into a modest apartment downtown, his furniture sparse, his nights long. He tried to call Grace, to plead, to bargain, but she never answered. Once he appeared at her office unannounced, his face haggard, his voice desperate. "Grace, please, we can fix this. We can start over." Grace looked at him steadily, her hand resting on her belly. "There is no we anymore, Martin. There never was. There was only me carrying you, and I am done." The words hit harder than any slap. He left with nothing. Grace stood at the balcony of her penthouse one evening, the city lights stretching endlessly before her. Her belly was round now, her child strong within her. She closed her eyes, the cool breeze brushing her skin. She remembered the night of the gala, the laughter, the wine spilling, the cruelty. She remembered Martin's smirk, Marissa's sneer, the crowd's ridicule. And she remembered her silence that had once felt like weakness but had always been her greatest strength. "They thought I was powerless," she whispered into the night, "but I was everything they feared." The storm had passed, but storms, she knew, always left behind new skies. She turned, walking back into her home, her hand over her belly. The future awaited, hers and her child's. And as she closed the balcony doors, her voice lingered like a promise. This is only the beginning. Grace's story reminds us of something powerful. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is survival. Sometimes silence is strategy. And sometimes silence is the storm that gathers until the moment it strikes. Martin believed he was untouchable. He believed his wife would remain humiliated, powerless, and silent forever. Marissa believed her beauty and arrogance gave her victory. But in the end, both of them were wrong. Grace endured their cruelty, their betrayal, their laughter, and when the time was right, she revealed what neither of them ever imagined. She was the true empire. It's a reminder that the people the world underestimates are often the ones holding the most power. That dignity, patience, and quiet strength can outlast cruelty and arrogance, and that sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't loud at all. It's simply living better, stronger, and freer than the ones who tried to break you. But what do you think? Do people like Martin ever truly change, or do they always destroy themselves in the end? And what about women like Grace? Should she forgive him for the sake of their child, or is his downfall the justice he earned? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below, and let's talk about it. And before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another story like this one.